Okay, today I'm pleased to introduce today's session, What's for Dinner, with vector search and natural language using Haystack and Milvus. And our guest speaker is Tilde Turium. Tilde is San Francisco-based artist and engineer. By day, they are free and open source software advocate at DeepSet. They can probably deadlift more than you. Ask them about how to paint an algorithm, the intersections between mutual aid and biology, or which coast has the best vegan croissants. Welcome, Tilde.
Hello, thank you so much for the warm introduction, Chrissy. It's very nice to meet you. So I'm going to share my screen and let's roll on with it. Can you see my slides, everybody? Great. I'm going to, yes, okay, cool. Let me look at the chat, make sure I'm keeping an eye on everything. So, yeah, as mentioned, my name is Tilda. I'm based in San Francisco. I'm a senior developer advocate at DeepSet working on the Haystack open source framework, and I'm based in San Francisco. And my interests, other than powerlifting and art, are surprise vegan cooking, as you could probably tell from the title of this webinar. So today, what we're going to go over, I'm going to give you a brief overview of Haystack just to make sure you have context to understand the code walkthrough. We'll introduce Milvus as well. I'll show you the application that I built, and then we'll have an informal Q&A. And I would really love for this to be helpful to you. So please drop any questions you have in the chat, and we will follow up with them at the end. But just to kind of get a sense of people's prior knowledge and where you're at, can you say in the chat who here has heard of Haystack before? No. Okay, perfect. We will start from the beginning. So Haystack is an open source framework for building production ready large language model applications. So we let you connect your data in whatever format you have it in to whatever model you want while being flexible and easy to use. The basic building blocks of Haystack, which I will talk more extensively about in a second, are pipelines and components. And we will send these slides out to you after the webinar so that if you want to reference any of these reference materials, you'll be able to do that. So don't worry about needing to frantically screenshot this QR code. DeepSet Cloud, our commercial offering, is actually built on top of the Haystack framework. Now, how many of you have heard of retrieval augmented generation before? Yes. Cool. Um, Retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, is very hot in the large language model space now. And what it basically means for anybody that doesn't know is giving a large language model additional context so it can give you a better, more accurate answer to the question. And I was at PyCon this weekend, and this was the best example that I could find showing RAG with Haystack in 3 lines of code. So basically, we have a URL, which is the Haystack website, and we have a question, which we then pass to a large language model, get a response back explaining what Haystack is based on the document provided and giving us a little bit of metadata. So it's cool that you don't need like a huge amount of lines of code to make that happen. Although, of course, things can get quite more complicated. So Haystack is actually 4 years old. We've been doing natural language processing since before it was cool. Although at the time in 2020, when it was released, it was focused on the use cases that were more popular at the time, such as like semantic search, extractive question answering, table QA. But then in 2022, everything changed. Large language models went mainstream, and we started seeing an explosion of use cases of people wanting to support RAG and agents. So we decided to pause, re-architect our framework to better support those use cases. And then in March, we released Haystack 2.0, which is more focused on the way that people are writing AI apps these days, as well as having a more flexible, extensible, better developer experience. And I will give you enough of an overview of Haystack's features so that we can hopefully understand the code demo. So pipelines, as I mentioned before, are one of the building blocks of Haystack. They are powerful abstractions that allow you to define the flow of data through your LLM application. They're a graph. Everything's a graph. You get a graph and you get a graph. And the nodes in this graph, as it were, are called components. And you have complete flexibility over the way you arrange the components in the pipeline and the way that data passes through them. Now, this code is a slightly more complicated example than what I showed you earlier, but it's going to be like similar to the demo I'll show you. So let me walk you through it. We have a pipeline, which is like a Python object we're instantiating. We're adding some components to it, which is an embedder, a retriever to retrieve documents from a document store, prompt builder, which builds the prompt that is then sent to the large language model. We connect these things to specify which order the components are run in, and then give it some arguments so that we can actually run the pipeline. And Haystack also includes a utility to help you draw your pipeline, which is cool because you can actually get quite complex with the logic of how your pipeline flows. For example, pipelines support branches now. Let's say you wanted to run a RAG pipeline and you wanted to do what's called hybrid search, where you're using both keyword-based search and embedding-based search to find documents that are relevant to your query. Because the combination of these two things can sometimes produce better results than one alone. With Haystack, you can branch out, join the results again at the document joiner component, and then use the ranker to decide which results are best. Haystack also supports conditional routing. Let's say you have a RAG pipeline that wants to look for an answer in a database, but if it doesn't find it, you want to search the web or Slack or Notion or any other data source. Well, we have you covered. Pipelines can also contain loops, which are great if you want to generate output, such as structured output that needs to be validated that contains a certain shape. Now, my colleague wrote a demo where it takes meeting notes and then uses the looping pipeline to produce API calls that you could then send to the GitHub API to create issues, because typing up issues from meeting notes and getting them into GitHub is not my favorite thing. I don't know about you. So it's incredibly handy. And then finally, which is relevant to what we're talking about today, we have agent pipelines. Now, agents can call third-party functions to go out and do other things, make decisions like ask what the weather is, or help you construct a recipe. So excited to show you an example of what this looks like in practice. Now, Haystack also offers you a lot of flexibility in exactly how the data that is returned from the search is passed to the large language model, because we use a templating language called Jinja 2 that has loops and conditionals. And so you can really specify into exactly how your prompt is going to look. And this prompt template is just another component in the Haystack pipeline. So speaking of components, as I mentioned, they're the building blocks of a pipeline, the nodes in the graph. Now, Haystack provides a ton of components out of the box for common tasks like retrieving documents from a document store, pre-processing and removing white space, summarizing text, or routing queries like some of those conditional, branching pipelines that I showed you earlier. But in addition to the out-of-the-box components, you can write your own custom components in just a few lines of code. Now, all you really need, it's a Python class. You got a decorator. And we want to know what are the inputs and outputs that this component expects so that we can serialize the pipeline. And then what arguments are needed to actually run the component. Give you an example of what this looks like in real life. Our friends over at Gina AI wrote a blog post on using a Haystack pipeline to deduplicate Jira tickets, because who among us hasn't filed an issue or filed a bug and thought you were being a good citizen, but then you're like, oh no, someone already reported this, my bad. But this custom components ideally have one job and only one job. This one is just deduplicating the keys. So if you want a little more detail about that, you can check out their blog post, which specifies how they built the entire project. Now, some more general Haystack features. Haystack is model and database agnostic because we want to be able to support whatever data source you have, whatever model you want to use. And we also want to be able to incorporate additional databases or additional data sources. RAG does not just mean vector databases. Like the web is a rich source of content. And, if there's an API for it, if it exists on the web, Haystack can help you get it into a pipeline. Haystack, the core of it is meant to be kind of like a lightweight, flexible library, but we have many extensions and integrations in order to extend the functionality, including like extensions that support models and vector databases, as well as like tracing and monitoring and everything you need to get your app into production, including the Milvus integration, which is maintained by our friends over here. So speaking of Milvus, um, is an open source vector database designed for high scalability. And vector databases are specialized systems designed for managing and retrieving unstructured data. They excel at semantic similarity searches and to make them great for writing applications with large language models, especially if you have a lot of data you're operating over. Um, Christy, what am I missing? I am not an expert on vector databases, so I wanted to ask you to add additional
Oh,
context.
that sounds great. Yeah, I usually just talk about storing and indexing and searching vectors.
Cool. All right, so let's do a live demo of this What is for Dinner application. But first, um, I started this project thinking I'd use a Kaggle data set, but then I looked at it and it was like, oh, this doesn't actually contain the recipe data from my favorite cookbook. It's just metadata. That's not actually very useful, but that's okay because as I mentioned, Haystack is very flexible in how you get the data into the application. And the code that I've written uses several different formats to accomplish that. But showing is easier than telling, so I'm going to roll over to my editor now. Um, how is my font size?
I think a little bigger.
A little bigger. Cool. Is that good?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's good.
okay.
Thanks.
Great. Cool. So first we are connecting to the Milvus document store. And because I wanted like one instance of this that could be passed around between the different components. And this is running in a Docker container on my local machine. Oh, excuse me. So the first pipeline that I ran um, was an indexing pipeline. Now, indexing pipelines take in data. Um, and like many other people, I'm not the most organized person all the time. So I have three recipes that I've written, but oh no, they're in different file formats because I wasn't thinking about ingesting them into a pipeline when I wrote them. But that's okay because Haystack can take these recipes, no matter what type they are, and actually ingest them into a document store. And I will show you exactly how that is done. So, the first component we have is a file type router that takes different types of files and it specifies which types we accept. And then each type of file, which is text, markdown, and PDF, kind of takes a converter component, which will convert it to a Haystack document. And then we have a document joiner, which like makes these three branches become one and like joins all the results. Anytime you're pre-processing documents, you want to like clean them, remove the white space, all that fun stuff. And then want to split them into chunks. You can split by word or paragraph, depending on like what kind of document it is, how long the chunks of text tend to be. I thought for recipes, 150 words seemed like a good size. And then with an overlap of 50 to make sure that we're sort of not missing anything. And then we use this sentence transformers document embedder to actually make those documents into vectors with this model, which is lightweight enough to run on my local machine without causing any hiccups. And then we want to write those to the Milvus document store. So then we make our Haystack pipeline, and we got to add all these components to the pipeline. And then we got to use the connect method to specify which component is connected to the next component so that we know which order to run them. And then over here, we're just saying, hey, here's where these files live. And we're going to run the pipeline with the file type router saying input all these files. So let me roll over to here and I'll say Python pre-processing, and hopefully this will work. Great. So it was spitting out this error. It just started spitting out this error this morning, and I think it is a side effect that is not actually relevant because, as you can see, we still have 6 um, files in our database, so I'm not going to worry about it, but sorry about that. So then if we go, we have this RAG pipeline, which will actually like um, show you how to query the document store. So we have a prompt, which is like answer the questions based on the given context. It loops through the documents that are provided and also provides the question to the large language model. And it's a pretty similar API to what we used before. Um, we have a RAG pipeline. We're adding an embedder, which important uses the same model that we were using to create these embeddings. We have our document store, which is the same instance of a document store. We have our prompt builder, which takes this and then makes it into a prompt, which is understandable by the pipeline. And we have our large language model. We're using the OpenAI generator here, but as I mentioned, Haystack is flexible and you can use whatever, any of the major models that your heart desires. So we connect all these things and then let's pass a question, which is what ingredients would I need to make all 3 of these recipes? So let's roll over here and run. All right, so our replies to make keto eggplant lasagna, flan and hemp cheese. And it looks to be actually listing all of the recipes. And since these recipes are specific to me, right, this doesn't exist on the web, then I know that it's not the large language model using its prior knowledge. It's actually using the input that we provided, which is pretty cool. But as I mentioned before, I'm not the world's most prolific cookbook author. I have a lot of other hobbies. I have a lot of stuff going on. So I wanted to also add additional data. So we have another index pipeline that takes data from the web. And it's not that different from the index pipeline we used before, except it does use the Haystack link content fetcher, which is a component we provide that will take a URL and turn that URL into Haystack documents so that you don't have to like write a scraper and scrape it yourself and decide what's important about that. Um, so we also need a converter to convert the HTML to documents. And like before, we need a writer and an embedder that uses that same model that we were using before. So these URLs I'm using are actually, it is the cookbook, my favorite cookbook, The Veganomicon by Isa Chandra Moskowitz. Like she has a lot of her recipes online and recipes are not able to be copyrighted legally, fun fact, which is why they all start out at the beginning with like, my hubby and my dog hated this recipe, which like no one wants that, right? But with this, we can avoid it. So I passed this list of URLs into the indexing pipeline and let's go ahead and run it. Mm. Web index pipeline. Let me make this bigger as well. Probably be easier for you to read.
Oh, great. I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, cool. So there's that. And then what I did here, now this gets really interesting, right? I've decided to make another RAG pipeline. We could have used our original RAG pipeline, but I wanted to get a little fancy with it. Um, because I wanted to make a pipeline that we could easily like wrap into a function and then provide as a tool so that other pipelines could actually call this function and say, hey, vegan chef, help us write a recipe. So I added a little wrapper so that this works as a standalone. So let's run the chef pipeline script just to prove that it works. And it's asking about buffalo wings and lasagna bolognese, which are some of the recipes here that we have ingested into the pipeline. So this is chef pipeline. Aha. So to make buffalo wings, you would need a 14-ounce block of extra firm tofu, salt. Oh man, this is making me hungry. even though it's pretty early in the morning here, but I'm basically always hungry. Um, but again, you can tell, like if I had just asked OpenAI how to make buffalo wings, it would certainly provide me with an answer that included meat, which is not this. So I know that it is taking this from the document store where it is supposed to. Now let's look at where we are actually using tools to wrap this function. So we are importing the chef pipeline from the file where we defined it, and then made a function called ask a vegan chef, just basically just like it runs a pipeline with some arguments, which it just like some JSON and the query we're passing in prints the response just because I like printing things to make sure my code is doing anything at all, so I'm not just sitting there freaking out. And then OpenAI, in order to provide your function as a tool, it has given you like a JSON spec that you must follow. So you have to say, what type of tool is this? It is a function. A function has a name, it has a description, some parameters, it takes a query, which is a string, and it describes it. And it is a required parameter. So there's sort of like two different ways of calling large language models right now. There's generation, which is what we were doing in our basic RAG pipelines, where we just pass it a prompt. But really, all the large language models are sort of moving towards a chat completion API, which is more like an agent. Um, so this in this, we're going to do some agentic chat message. We're going to say, hey, it's a message from a system. You're a helpful and knowledgeable agent, and you have access to your personal vegan chef. Isn't that cool? And ask them about vegan recipes. And then the user says, what ingredients would I need to make buffalo wings and lasagna bolognese? And then again, here we use Haystack's wrapper for the OpenAI chat generator, which you do need an API key for this, which I have saved in my environment variables because, I like you and I'm sure you're all very cool and trustworthy people, but I just don't know you that well yet. So here we're going to actually call this function and see what kind of chat message it produces. So let's run Python tools py. Aha. Oh, I have a key error. Did I delete something? Oops. Hmm. Interesting. Available functions, function name. I really don't see where there's a typo here. Aha, there we go. I didn't change anything. You saw that. I'm not crazy, right? Well, who knows? Computers, right? But anyway, so we get a message back from the large language model that is kind of like explaining in natural language to make buffalo wings. Here's the ingredients you need. And it's a little bit different than the response that we received before. It gives you a little more sort of context in English, which is nice. And that is really as far as I have gotten. Um, so let me just pause and kind of look at what questions that we have, and we can take it more conversationally from here.
Great. Thank you, Tilda. Um, so in your agent, it looked like you only had one function. Would you be able to add more than one function to that?
Yeah, I think it would be cool to like what if you had one that just got ingredients? What if you had one that suggested recipe ideas? Or like I would love an integration that like emailed you a shopping list so that you didn't have to pull it out of an application, right? So that'd be cool.
Okay, I see a question in the chat. Nikolai asks, could you recommend strategies for dealing with large amount of files? Like, let's say I've got Italian recipes, French recipes, etc.
Yeah, metadata labeling, if you've got a lot of files, is really huge. And so that way, like when you're doing search, you can say, hey, like I want to filter out files that are not Italian recipes. So yeah, again, just like doing a little bit of thought on the front end to make sure that your files have the metadata that you want will save you headaches later on when you want to search it, or especially like dates, right? A lot of times people want to filter or re-rank by recency. So that could be like another great piece of metadata to support. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And also you can Milvus as a vector database, all of the fields except the vector we refer to as metadata, and metadata filtering is possible in search with Milvus.
Wonderful.
As the database geek here, it probably was there, but skipped over my eyes when you were doing the Milvus call. I didn't see which vector database index you were using.
Um, the OpenAI functions can call an API REST. Yeah, we're just like wrapping the OpenAI API for you in Haystack to make that easier. But like, yeah, they're just essentially calling those models from the cloud.
Okay, there's probably some default setting in there for because
Yeah,
index in database refers to a data structure, and we have different data structures like clustering or um, uh,
yeah,
trees. So yeah, I guess I have to look at your code to figure out.
yeah. I can show you. I just used the default setting from your documentation, which was very easy to get started with. So, if this is helpful, like this is
Oh,
what I
then
use.
maybe you're using our auto index, which defaults to HNSW. Okay, I see a question.
Yeah,
Fabian asks, the OpenAI functions can call an API REST. That's the
yeah.
question.
Yeah. I mentioned Haystack. The Haystack generators are like a wrapper for the Open API call. So as long as you have your OpenAI key saved as an environment variable in your environment, then we will just take care of that in the background for you, passing that secret. And it's not just OpenAI, right? You can use any of the major model providers like Anthropic's Claude, Mixtral. You can run local models with a llama. It's really quite flexible because the models are really in an arms race and we want to support like whatever one best fits your specific use case.
Where do people see which models are supported?
Ah, I can show you that in the Haystack documentation. Oop, let me stop sharing this. So our documentation is quite comprehensive. And if you look at generators, we have a guide that explains like how this all really works. um the difference between generators versus chat generators, which I kind of showed you earlier. There's like, a generation API versus chat completion that just like requires you to pass in more parameters, um and then gives you like a more agent-like response. But then here's all the models we support, right? Like AWS Bedrock, Azure Cohere, Gradient, many models off of Hugging Face. Yeah, so it's quite an extensive list.
Mhm.
Good questions.
So are there other agent types that Haystack supports?
Um, in terms of like agent types, I'm like our agent features are still being built right now. What you can do with agents, I didn't show all of this today, but like function calling, which we did demonstrate in tools, routing, fallbacks, if you don't get an answer you want, looping, and pro producing structured output. But what we don't have yet that is on our roadmap is support for memory, which is a really important, like if you really want a conversational dialogue that goes back and forth, we need to support that. So that is on our roadmap for this quarter. Support for multi-agents, which is also quite hot. and just making sure our overall developer experience makes sense. So we have our since we're open source, our roadmap is public on GitHub, and you can check that out to see how we are making progress against that. But does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah, I was wondering what kind of agentic features.
Yeah.
Um, we actually had a maybe personal question for you. We had a speaker the other day for our Milvus meetup who was creating an open source memory system. And what's your take on open source versus closed source for memory systems?
Oh man.
Or
It
just in general, like you've got a lot of generators there, I noticed, that are open source as well as closed source.
um Well, all the generators themselves, those are like wrappers for APIs. So they're all open. The generators themselves, the wrapper classes are open source. Like, yes, we do call closed source models, but like it's a nuanced question, right? Because some people open source models and like what they do is they publish a bunch of weights and they're like, here you go, with like no real instruction or context on how to actually build and run the model yourself, right? Like open source isn't a binary, it's a gradient. And so I personally before I joined DeepSet, I worked on Atom, the open source editor. So like I'm really bullish on work in public, show your work, allow people to contribute, but that has to be balanced with like how does this support your business strategy, and like who's going to do the emotional labor of like making sure that you and the community are on the same page. But like at Haystack, we have regular office hours where like when we're going to build a new feature like evaluation, we ask our community to show up and weigh in, and even like, compensate them for their time in certain cases to just really make sure that we have the communities as first and foremost the champions and the consumers of our products, so we're building what works best for you. But that being said, AI is a rapidly shifting ecosystem and landscape, and like sometimes we have to support more closed source things because that is what the general consensus is that everybody is using, and we want our product to be useful as well. So I feel like I just rambled at you about open source,
Okay.
my opinions. Does that make sense? Am I answering your question?
Yeah, possibly. Um, so is this is very naive question for me from myself. Maybe other people were wondering too. So I'm in terms of like integrators, I know about LangChain and I know about Llama Index. Should I think about Haystack as another option for me, another open source option for an integrator?
Yes, that is like exactly the category where we see ourselves. And like each framework has different strengths and weaknesses, right? Like LangChain has a huge community. It's very easy to get started with, but like the complaints we hear about LangChain are like, oh, this tutorial is 3 weeks old and it's already broken. And Haystack, we have like a history of maintaining backwards compatibility and resources, like specifying our deprecation policy. We really want to give you features to make your app production ready and be a little bit more stable. Um, and Llama Index is really focused on like the data processing piece of it. So like we even have an integration between Haystack and Llama Index if you wanted to
Oh,
use both.
that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like you can be a collaborator and competition at the same time. But like, yeah, they're all great tools. We're all solving similar problems, and we just kind of have different approaches in how we think about those problems.
Great. Well, I see people are there, but I don't see any questions. I'm going to read your documentation about Haystack's view of LLM generators versus chat completers. That's an interesting nuance.
Yeah, the
Maybe could you
model
say a bit?
providers,
Yeah.
yeah, the model providers, I think, are really trying to shift people away from the sort of generators to the chat completers because I think that it like gives them a little bit more flexibility to like this is my take, right? I didn't call OpenAI and get their PR department to vet my answer. But my personal opinion on this is like you can produce a chat message from the system, right? It makes it a lot harder to like put words in the AI's mouth. So like they have a little bit more control over making sure that they're producing a response that is going to be a good user experience and consistent with what they want to provide. Um, Plus, everybody seems to want agents, right? We seem to have settled on like chat as like the primary model for how people are using LLMs now. And so like that gives you a little bit more tools to produce that kinds of experience. So like that is my opinion on why this change is being made. But hopefully I'll run into someone from OpenAI at an event at some point and I can kind of like run this past them and see if they agree with me or not. Oh, we have a question. In a hypothetical scenario, using RAG pipeline and Haystack, can the pipeline initiate the retrieval step for a second query before processing the generation step of the first query, rather than executing these steps sequentially? Um, yeah, as long as the second query result doesn't depend on the results of the first query, you absolutely can do that. I made a pipeline where we have multiple different querying steps where we the LLM. So I made a medical chatbot that pulls papers from PubMed, and the first query is where we take the question, we make that into query like keywords that we can use to search PubMed because their API takes keywords, not natural language. Return some papers, and then we pass those papers back to the large language model so it can produce its answer in natural language. So yes, like you can have pipelines with multiple steps that call the um, LLMs at multiple steps depending on what your use case is. But does that answer your question? And what are you building? This has got me curious.
See. Oh, I think I can, let me see if I can. Yeah, there we go. I just unmuted you, Alex, if you'd like to say something.
Hey, I was just investigating how Haystack works, and of course, when you deploy a RAG pipeline, you have multiple queries, multiple users that are trying to use it in the same time, and usually the pipeline is taking some time on the retrieval step and also in the generation step, and there is no reason to wait for the generation step for end step before starting the retrieval step for the next step. So um, I was looking on some way to make sure that the queries are not executed sequentially if they are independent.
So you want to be able to like run different queries in parallel.
Uh, yes, or
Like,
just at least send the request asynchronously.
yeah, async support is coming. That is also on our Q2 roadmap. We have not built it yet. So stay tuned for details, and hopefully we're going to have that out soon because that is a feature the community wants. I agree it's really important, and we don't quite have support for it yet. So
Okay, thank you.
Rishi asks, how does Haystack compare with Llama Index? Yeah, so Llama Index focuses more on like data processing. They have like a lot more functionality for that. Um, Llama Index also has a like JavaScript SDK, whereas we do not. So, but they're both great frameworks, and there's actually a Haystack integration with Llama Index should you want to use both. So, those are kind of like we have, I think, a little bit more focus on tools to get your app into production than Llama Index does. So there's pros and cons, but yeah, they're both really solid products, to be honest.
Um, let's see. Well, if we don't have any more questions, oh, okay, we have more questions. So Jim is asking in the chat, you demonstrated several pipelines. Would each pipeline be deployed as its own web service?
Yes, because indexing pipelines where we ingest data have sort of like a different needs in terms of like being, IO bound versus um versus CPU bound. And so like we wouldn't want to have the same configuration for all of our pipelines, but we do have a package called Hayhooks, which uses Fast API to help you deploy an individual Haystack pipeline, via Kubernetes, and it exposes those API endpoints. So I can point you to the documentation where we have a little bit more information about that. We can't have like a one size fits all deployment guide because it really depends on what your pipeline is doing, but we at least have some materials to get you kind of started in the right direction. Thank you. These are great questions. Appreciate you all being so engaged.
And if people want to get started, do you have a place where you usually point people as the best place?
Yeah. On our website, we have, let me share my screen again. Yeah. So on our website, we have a bunch of tutorials, and those are just Colab notebooks where they're rendered and you can just start running and playing with them. We have videos on YouTube that explain if that's how you learn. We have regular meetups. We have a Discord server where you can have support. You can read our code on GitHub. So depending on your preferred method of learning, we have many ways to get started. But our documentation gets a lot of love. So I would just start poking around our website and see what speaks to you.
Are those meetups virtual or in person?
Both.
Where are you located?
I'm in San Francisco, but DeepSet is distributed across Europe. So we've had meetups in Pittsburgh, San Francisco, London, and Berlin over the past couple of months. So if you subscribe to our Luma calendar, as well as several virtual meetups and webinars. So if you subscribe to our calendar, then you can stay in the loop about what we're planning next.
Okay, well, I think that looks like it. Give them 1 more minute if they want to ask more questions. Otherwise, we will call it a wrap.
Well, thank you so much. You've been a lovely audience. And if you have any questions, please hit us up and hope to see you. Oh, do we have one more
Wait,
question?
I see something in the Q&A area.
Thanks for the event.
Oh, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Yeah. Wonderful chatting with you this morning, and have a great rest of your day. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.